The Thursday, November 29, 2018 special meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. Could we please have a roll call?
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Commissioner Mackin?
Here.
Commissioner Patel?
Here.
Commissioner Ison?
Here. All members are present. Could we please have a motion for adoption of the agenda?
I'll move to adopt the agenda.
And a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No. Nothing on the consent calendar tonight, so we move into oral communications. Is there any item not on tonight's agenda that anyone would like to address the commissioners? Seeing none, we'll move on. We have no written communications. We move into our new business of the evening. This is a public hearing. It will be regarding 3,000 to 3,500 Marina Boulevard. And this is a design permit modification, DP-1-18, variance V-1-18, and use permit UP-1-18. There's also an environmental review, and this is a site plan and design modifications to a previously approved office project, and this will allow development of a life science campus comprised of 3 5- to 6-story buildings constructed above a 2-level parking podium, totaling 422,552 square feet of floor area on a vacant 8.87 acre site. The applicant is Sierra Point LLC owner. Could we have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairperson. So again, the requested actions before you tonight are to modify design permit, variance, and use permit approvals for development of this vacant site at 3,500 Marina Boulevard out in Sierra Point, as well as adoption of an addendum to the 2008 initial study and mitigated negative declaration prepared for the project. So we've had a couple study sessions on this project, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the site vicinity and approvals, but in general, in 2009, the City Council approved the original proposal for development of this site with 2 office buildings and a parking garage, and that was the approvals for that project were then extended in 2011, and that was formalized in 2012 with adoption of a development agreement. The development agreement also imposed some requirements on the construction of the building, specifically to LEED Gold standards, and extended the project approvals until 2022. And then just last year, the council amended the development agreement to require on-site solar energy production as well, and then further extend the approvals to 2027. And then, of course, this year, the applicant has submitted some plans to provide an alternate design for the site. So the design permit alternative, as described, this would be a slightly smaller project compared to the 2009 approved project. So just over 420,000 square feet of building area split into 3 separate structures. There would be 5- and 6-story buildings built above a 2-level parking podium. The podium itself would contain about 650 parking spaces, and then the surface parking lot would have about 130 spaces, 8 of which would be available to the public, and that's required by BCDC for the public shoreline access. Also included in this project, as with the prior iteration, would be bay trail and public space improvements within the shoreline band. So in regards to approving the design permit modification, there are quite a few findings for the design permit. They're detailed in the first exhibit to the approving resolution and summarized in the staff report, and I won't belabor them here, but generally we've kind of grouped them into 5 different categories. So when it comes to building design, form, and details, so obviously development in Sierra Point is subject to the combined site and architectural design guidelines for Sierra Point. Those guidelines have very detailed requirements for spacing between buildings, maintenance of view corridors, how many stories different parcels can be developed with, etc. So this proposal does comply with the guidelines contained in that document, as well as the development standards contained in the SPCRO zoning district. And the actual design itself, again, they're going for a campus feeling, so while each building is differentiated in some way, it still comes together very cohesively. All the exterior materials comply with the guidelines in the Sierra Point guidelines. The articulation, floor area limits, etc., all are compliant. And so when it comes to landscaping in open areas, so the Sierra Point design guidelines have very specific guidance for landscaping these sites. And then there are a minimum landscape area that the Sierra Point commercial district requires as well. So this proposal would provide about 35% of the site in total with landscaped area. So that exceeds the minimum of 25%. So those landscape areas would be, not just aesthetic, but functional as well. So they're providing biotreatment planted areas to provide stormwater retention and treatment, as well as screening the parking podium itself, providing shade trees in the parking lot, and then, of course, the amenity improvements in the area adjacent to the Bay Trail in the northern portion of the site, as well as the interior courtyard. So quite a lot of landscaping. As is discussed in more detail in the staff report and with conditions of approval, the final landscape plan will comply with our water conservation and landscaping ordinance, as well as the other applicable requirements for the landscape irrigation design and that sort of thing. So moving on to circulation, access, and parking. So part of the environmental review for this project included a site plan review by consulting traffic engineers, and that's summarized in Appendix C to the addendum that was attached to your staff report. But overall, the proposed site circulation was found to be safe and functional, compliant with best practices and any applicable municipal code regulations. With the conditions of approval, which did identify a few tweaks to the parking garage circulation, the plan would comply with those best practices. And then, of course, when it comes to the amount of parking, that would be addressed in the use permit discussion that I'll move on to shortly. Okay, and the last two segments or categories of findings really fall under the public access, view corridors, and sustainability aspects. So when it comes to public access, so like every other lot in Sierra Point, a portion of this site does fall within the jurisdiction of BCDC. And this project actually in September went to the BCDC Design Review Board and has been, the design has been tweaked in compliance with the feedback they heard at that meeting. So the Bay Trail improvements, that's a huge part of this project. So the Bay Trail does run along the north side of the site right now. Some of you may have walked it. It is a paved path. That is not the end condition once the project has been constructed. So in addition to expanding and enhancing the trail that's there to comply with the Bay Trail design standards, there will be some landscaping involved, some public areas that I'm sure the applicant will go over in detail with some native planting. There will be, let's see, I guess I don't have it on this slide. Another important part of the project that also kind of came out of the discussions with BCDC was allowing the interior courtyard to be accessible from the Bay Trail. So basically the courtyard would be a public-private space. So someone jogging on the trail could actually go up either the ramp or the stairway and then sit in the courtyard area, go to the cafe, enjoy the space, along with people working there. And then when it comes to sustainability, of course, our development agreement, the requirements for constructing to LEED Gold standards and providing on-site renewable energy generation would be retained. So this project does require a variance, as the prior iteration did, to lot coverage, whereas the prior design required the lot coverage variance because they had this, they were splitting the site basically into two different parcels. This project would not divide the site into different parcels. However, the podium design itself technically would count as, the podium would count as lot coverage because it's occupying the site and it's raised above the ground. I think obviously functionally the podium allows for a lot of open areas on the site. It allows for the building footprints to be a little bit smaller. So while technically it is lot coverage, we think the design actually kind of works around it to make sure that the intention in controlling how much the footprint of structure is covering the lot, the project actually meets a lot of those intentions with its design by incorporating landscaping and other open areas onto the podium itself. And of course, to approve a variance, we have to find that there are special circumstances applicable to the site and that the project would be conditioned to assure that it's not a grant of special privilege, which we feel the findings can be made there. And lastly, for the use permit. So as you guys have discussed a couple times now, the municipal code does not have a parking requirement that's specific to life science uses. So what we've done is we've applied an office requirement as the next closest requirement. So our office requirement is 1 space for every 300 square feet of building area. As we've seen a use permit just this year at 7,000 Marina for another life sciences project that was proposing a lesser parking ratio there. Similarly, this applicant is proposing a lesser parking ratio compared to the office standard. It's about 1 to every 550 square feet. So not only have we kind of established that these uses generally have a lesser parking threshold, they've also submitted a transportation demand management plan that details a lot of strategies to encourage employees to use other means of transportation rather than driving a car. So those are as detailed as providing free transit passes. Every large employer, has to participate in the shuttle program that serves Sierra Point from Balboa Park BART and the Bayshore Caltrain Station. So that's just one of the strategies that's detailed in the TDM plan. The TDM plan, as designed, would actually reduce their parking demand below the proposed supply. So, with full implementation of that plan, the proposed parking would be more than adequate for use of the site. So, and lastly, touching on the environmental analysis. So, the 2008 ISMND, which was also amended in 2016 when the DA was amended as well. The CEQA allows for, if an analysis concludes that there's no trigger essentially for a brand new environmental review, we're permitted to adopt an addendum. So you all saw the addendum attached to your staff report containing an updated initial study checklist, which did conclude that the 2008 ISMND is still valid, and the addendum would update 2 of the mitigation measures, I believe, under the water utility section. Because the applicant had agreed during when we were creating those amendments to the mitigation measures, we can go ahead and adopt the addendum under CEQA law. So, and I did want to point out as well, before I turn it over to the applicant, at your dais there's an errata sheet. So that contains a revision to the last condition of approval in the draft resolution, basically to include references to the previously approved land use permits, just to emphasize that they would not be extinguished with approval of this current design alternative. And then lastly would be a revision to mitigation measure UTL 5B in the addendum, which would change the timing of payment of a fee to fund a study for aquifer injection and water banking to prior to issuance of the building permit. And we've also addressed that with the applicant prior to this evening, and they've agreed to that. So, with that, I'll end my presentation and either leave it open to questions or whatever your pleasure.
Thank you, Julie. Commissioner Ison, would you like to start with some questions for staff?
I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. Commissioner Gooding?
My main concern, which we can also address with the applicants, is about the biggest change, as I see it, is really the parking. in terms of the possible impact on other sites and traffic. So what sort of history, how much history do we have about similar uses like life sciences, and whether they sort of provably or whether it's kind of a reliable assumption that they will have much lighter uses? And maybe that's a question better addressed to the applicant. I'll let you folks tell me.
Yeah, I think we had that discussion with the Sangamo use permit in Brisbane. We don't have a lot of experience. I know the applicant has other projects, and I'm sure they would be glad to sort of elaborate on some of their experience with parking requirements and projects in South City and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Gomez?
Beat me to it. It was around the significant change in parking, but I think we'll address those with the applicant, so thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Patel?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. I have one question, just a clarification point, if you could, please. There's a clay cap to go in place. As I understand it, it is not yet a closed landfill. Could you please explain that to the audience here at home? What that entails? It is a former landfill, and also who has jurisdiction over the closure?
The landfill currently is closed. It was basically it's covered with a clean cap, but it's not a official cap that complies with state regulations under Title 27. And as part of the pre-development for this site, that formal clay cap will be established. That sort of feature is subject to review by County Health and Regional Water Quality Control Board. They're the regulatory agencies over that site.
And could you explain at what point that would take place?
Well, closure would occur prior to site preparation and grading. So closure would have to, well, or in conjunction with, but perhaps the applicant can address that in more detail. And I just did want to note that we routed this application to the Regional Water Quality Control Board and County Environmental Health. And they had no modifications to the mitigation measures that were already approved in the 2008 ISMND.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, we will open the public hearing. I know the applicant's here. If you'd like to step to the podium, please announce who you represent, your name. Whoever would like to start, up to you. Yes, absolutely.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Michael Garrity. I'm the president of Phase 3. We are the applicant for the site. We've had the pleasure of coming and presenting our ideas for this project over the last year. And so we're excited to be here tonight and ask for your approval of our design. I'm going to be relatively brief, but we do have a team available here to help answer questions. So I'm going to have SOM, our architects, come up and walk through some of the changes. It's still very similar to the last iteration, but there have been some tweaks from our meeting with BCDC, as was mentioned. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Duncan at SOM, and he'll walk us through our presentation, and then we are available for more questions.
Great, thank you. Good evening, good to see you all again. The changes are actually pretty minor. I can do this fairly quickly if you'd like. I think you're all familiar with it. You know the site, and you're familiar with setbacks and access. This was the previous proposal. There are, as you know, access comes from the freeway. Good sight lines is a very, very visible project. We're very excited by that. And it'll be an important landmark for Sierra Point, Brisbane. There are great views out, and part of the strategy of raising the podium up off the ground was to give advantage to those views, also to raise a public space, and nice views back to the mountain. Good sun exposure, but as you know, a fair bit of wind comes from the west and the northwest. So we've been careful to arrange our buildings in a kind of C shape, opening out toward the ocean, toward the bay, but also trying to protect those spaces from the wind. You're familiar with the site. We had a good discussion last time about the slough and the importance of it, and that's been an important part of our discussion with BCDC. And as you know, we actually moved our building further back from the edge, which led to a little bit higher but you've seen that already, so that hasn't changed. But that's an important waterfront element of our consideration. This is an old diagram, but it essentially shows the project where we have office and lab buildings, 3 of them, that sit on top of a 2-story podium. But this is really seen as a public space, not just for the campus. That has restaurants, meeting areas, cafes, access to the waterfront, and really access to the front door, and 2 stories of parking with the bay trail shown in green that wraps around the edge. This is a really unique opportunity to complete the bay trail at Sierra Point. It's gone 3/4 of the way around. The red dashed line, as you can see, let's see if I can. So you can see here, the dashed line is where it was. We have the opportunity then to take that and extend the green line along the edge of the slough, and with the applicant's second project to the south that they own, 1000 Marina, we can continue that and complete the complete loop of the Bay Trail. So we're working together with the site to the south to access that whole western edge. Here you can get a close-up. We are still providing the access from 500 Marina, which is that smaller dashed green line, and then continuing down to 1000 in the yellow. We have pushed the mass of the building back, and so now there is some planting, there's some parking, there's some more planting, and the mass of the building then is pulled away from the edge of the slough. The red line shows vehicular access. We have access to the garage in 3 spots, arrows going in. The 2 large, let's see if I can get a pointer here. These are the 2 front doors in terms of access to the lobbies. The red line here accesses the garage on the edge. The blue dash line is service, and we're able then to service the buildings from the podium. And there is the purple line is our fire truck access that goes around the edge of the site, but then goes over turf block along the waterfront here, and then reconnects to that line here, and we're leaving that open for fire truck access. A little bit about the parking. Do we want to talk about this now?
Sure. My name is Daniel Jacobsen of Fair & Piers, Transportation Consultants. I can talk a little bit about the project parking demand and maybe the rationale behind the parking supply and TDM strategy behind it. The project, as shown previously, would provide approximately 780 spaces, and that's at a ratio of about 1.8 or 1.9 per 1,000 square feet. So that is lower than city code, which is 3.3 square feet per, or 3.3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. And the overall rationale behind, I think, a lower parking supply for R&D and an R&D office, really biotech-focused use. Typically, we see on the peninsula these projects supplying at about 1.5 to 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So that's looking at Genentech and Gilead and some of these major projects that have been built. Typically, these projects also they have TDM programs associated with them, but they also just have less employees, less overall employee intensity in their use characteristics relative to a typical office type use. So what you're seeing here on this chart in front of you, we have the analysis of what would happen if we were to supply this without a TDM plan, and how much demand and would we expect from a office R&D type use. And the answer is about 2.2, 2.3 to 2.5 per 1,000 square feet. So that's at 950 to about 1,050 spaces. So there is a shortfall of the parking supply in the project, and that shortfall is at about 170 to 280 spaces. That equates to about a 20 to 30% supply under the expected demand, and that is kind of what we've tailored the TDM program around. Do we have another slide in here? Is that in there? And the TDM plan would be focused around leveraging a number of existing services that are there and introducing some new ones specific to the site. So we already have the Sierra Point shuttle, which is carrying about 14% of all employees commuting to the Sierra Point area. We also have a range of strategies that are could be introduced to as a part of the project's TDM program. That includes subsidizing transit fares so that commuters who are taking the ferry or BART or Caltrain to the Sierra Point shuttle or accessing via other means can have free transit. We have parking cash out, which is a strategy where in lieu of receiving a parking permit, employees can cash out with typically pre-tax money and therefore have a little extra income and forego the ability to park at the site. And there's a range of other strategies that are listed on here that all typically amount to about a 16% reduction when put together, and that's based on the CAPCOA standards that the state tends to use for these types of projects. So overall, we have a pretty good sense that there's your maximum TDM reduction that you can get quantifiable through this range of TDM measures is around the 30% threshold. So the project's parking supply, in order to really make a 780 space supply work, you would have this ongoing monitoring and enforcement of the TDM program, probably coupled with peak period, so maybe lunchtime or midday valet parking, which again gives you another 75 to 150 spaces approximately in the garage. So I'm happy to answer further questions about that later, but that's a brief overview.
Great, thanks. This shows the ground floor plan showing the parking. It also shows the BCDC 8 public parking stalls on the lower left here that allows access to the Bay Trail, and these are our neighbors' parking stalls here that have access here. So we're kind of providing good access to either side of that Bay Trail. We have added some, I'll go into more detail, some seating, some planting, and other elements of the landscape plan. But going up to the second level here, this is pretty much unchanged from the last time you've seen it, with the event spaces, the restaurants, and the training rooms and boardrooms and business center really fronting on here, and then a small cafe. We've tried to make this raised podium as accessible as possible. We have a set of stairs and elevator access from the front door here. We have a set of stairs and stadium seating that overlooks the bay and invites people up from the Bay Trail. And we have an accessible route up a ramp, earth berm, and then up onto the building that gets you up to the upper level plaza here. And this courtyard steps down a little bit. You can see there's a small step here. I'll show you the section here as it goes down. So it provides then views out to the bay and to the East Bay beyond. There is a pedestrian access route here that gets you to the Bay Trail, and then, as we were talking about, continues out here. These two entrances, both from the bay and from the pub and from the front door, we really have tried to celebrate them and make them kind of public spirited. This is the view from the bay side, and you can see the planting, and there's a recreation area out in front here, in front of the health club, which opens up onto that space. There are steps that bring you up, and then there's seating and planting along the edge here with views out. There's more seating at the top here, and there's a slight change in grade before you get to the lawn. And then there is a ramp that allows you to access up here, and that is initially kind of built into the earth and then becomes part of the elevation. View from the southeast, from the drop-off, you have the two lobbies and then this large public space with the green cascading down. We've also bermed up the earth on this side against the two-story podium, and we've got planting on this side as well. This is a plan that highlights some of the landscape features. The biotreatment areas have been mentioned. They're scattered around the site for treating rainwater. There is bike racks that are both by the front door here and also some that serve the, let's see if I can get on my, it should be right here. I'll show you on another plan. And there is planting along the edge, shade planting on the parking, a ring of trees around the lawn here, and we've substituted an olive grove that we had before for a birch grove that we have taken out. These are some of the species we're looking to plant. We're looking for mostly California natives here and drought tolerant and suitable for this particular climate in this particular area. We've gone once through and sorted those out, and I'm not the landscape architect, but if there are additional questions on here, I can do my best to answer them. We have raised the Bay Trail up above the 50-year high water mark for expecting that the seawater rise will happen. We're about at the expectation for 75 years, so we think that if it does in 75 years, we have the ability then to add more, but I think we're good for about 50 here, and this is at the low side of the site. It gets higher as you go down along 101 along the western side. This also is a section that's taken really right through the middle of the project, and you can see how the landscape slopes up a bit, goes through a zone of planting and fitness on the ground, and then steps up through a series of ramps that has these two then upper levels of terrace, and then even the slight mounding at the green lawn in the middle, and that has sort of bench-like seating along the edge. These are site sections. On the left is on the toward 101. On the west side, we have moved, as we discussed before, the building back. That allows us to actually create a series of zones where we've got a 3-foot planting zone, we've got 12 feet of bay trail, and we are proposing that we use decomposed granite, easier on legs for running, and continue that to the edge of our site and take this all the way down to the south too with the same surface. And we have planting between cars, and then we have parking, surface level parking, and an extra 10-foot planting zone up against the building here. On the east side, you can see we've bermed up the planting against the edge, and we have a fire access and then biotreatment area, typically along the side between our neighbor. The buildings are pretty much unchanged in terms of heights and widths and depths since the last time. This is really done for lab dimensions and highly efficient buildings. They do have balconies on the ends. We'll go into that a little bit more detail on the elevation, and we've continued, as we talked about last time, the PVs on the roof and then PVs on the south-facing screen walls. This is the lower drawing is a section through the middle, and you give you a little sense of the elevations. And we have an arcade that goes around the base on the courtyard level, and we have some screening at the top for mechanical equipment on the roof. We brought the materials in here just from our last conversation to give you a little bit more idea of what the physical nature of the building, what it would look like. So, Alessandro, you can point. We have a concrete podium, much of which is burned up against, and probably use some precast down there as well as cast in place. And we're counting on natural ventilation for much of that podium too from the side. So our podium is generally in using concrete pavers on the paving surfaces, we've shown two tones of gray, and we're just at the beginning of this process, but we want to make this kind of an interesting landscape. We like the coolness of the bay. We like the color of the water. We see this as a very light building once you get above the podium, so it's a glass and metal building. One of the interesting features of this is we have glass and metal on the main facades with sunscreens, horizontal sunscreens, but at the ends of the buildings we have a perforated metal screen. We're showing two different types of perforation here. We're going to determine, see if I can see this area on the ends of each of them. The building projects out. This provides a little bit of windbreak through the perforations. It provides a little bit of sunbreak on the south side. It adds a little bit of cover on it. So it provides a kind of a partial enclosure, an outdoor enclosure, but also has a kind of diaphanous quality that you can see through and catches the light. So when the light is on the front of it, it has a little more opacity. When the light moves around behind it, it's a little like a theater scrim. You start to see through it. And particularly at the ends of these buildings, the north end of these buildings, where they are very visible to traffic coming by here, we really want to celebrate the ends here and the ends here and have that quality of daylight moving through it, both from being within the building, but also from the highway and access there. So we are really at the beginning of this composition, but I think that element seems very strong. We're enthusiastic about it, and I think could make some great spaces for people to come out on those non-windy days, overlook the bay or overlook the mountain, and step out of the office and have a little bit of a place to meet beyond the office interiors. The vision glass, we're trying to not have it be too reflective. It's I would call it a pretty clear glass. It's a high performance glass, but does not have a heavy tint on it and does not have a heavy mirror reflectance on it. Once again, it's kind of in the vocabulary of the blues and the grays that we're looking at. And maybe just hold up the silver metals that we're looking at for them. So we have screens on the roofs. We're looking in within a range of silvers here, and maybe a couple different silvers depending on which elements. I think you've reviewed the area summaries. Won't go into detail, and then we just talked about the parking. So maybe we'll stop there. If there are any other questions, and we can answer those.
If we could have you stay there, I'm sure we'll have some questions
Okay,
for
great.
you. Thank you. Commissioner Gomez, you want to start?
So,
And if we could, I'm sorry, if we could keep the topics, maybe if you
Yeah.
bring up parking,
Yeah.
let's get everyone's parking questions at the
Great.
same time.
yeah,
So let's start with parking.
thank you, Chairman Macking. It's a little bit of a pivot from the parking to the traffic, kind of in northbound and southbound, and forgive me, staff, because I think we talked about this for one of the other projects in the area. If I remember correctly, there is a plan somewhere where I think Caltrans is working on the off ramp to Sierra Point. Is that a correct statement, or am I imagining things?
The off-ramp, there's, again, the city can't require Caltrans to do anything, but
Right.
there was the desire to look at some restriping on the off-ramp, and then the city is in control of some signalization of that off-ramp, on-ramp that, again, when certain traffic thresholds are met, the various property owners who are still to be developing out there are obligated to help their fair share of paying for those signals when the public works director and department.
Okay, so it's a
makes that
collaborative
requirement.
effort.
Yes.
Across multiple jurisdictions. So this is kind of more my broader concern is what the daily kind of inflow outflow looks like as we're projecting 3-5 years into the future. That's really where my mind is at, is what that looks like. Less on the amount of parking that's there, because I think we're going to have a dynamic environment. If you get a single tenant in this building, they're probably going to have a pretty aggressive sustainability plan, just knowing how some of the other life science campuses work, right? So that's where I kind of take my parking concern comments back, actually. I think it's more around what does that inflow, outflow look like from a day-to-day commuting hour perspective. And
Well,
That's
again,
a
back,
question mark. I don't think we can answer that.
yeah. Well, I think, again, just in terms of how this
Yeah.
issue is handled, again, the studies that date back from 2005, which have been sort of updated periodically, have, again, looked at these issues of future traffic demand. The Public Works Department monitors the functioning of various intersections, and when there are certain delays and certain warrants are met to install signals, that's typically when they go ahead and do that. So there's an ongoing monitoring, and they have, again, mitigations that have been well established and in place to address those sort of increase in traffic demand and flow over time.
Okay.
The one data point I'd add to that is the prior approval on what could be built on the site today is an office project. And as Daniel spoke, office projects tend to have a much higher intensity, almost double what we'll have in a research and development.
Right.
So from a pure if you're worried about more bodies or less bodies coming and going, by moving this to life science, we're actually reducing the number of bodies overall that will actually be coming out onto Sierra Point. So that would alleviate, at least over the prior iteration, that concern by moving in this direction.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ison?
Nothing, I mean, I'm just gonna make a little comment. I think we're all pretty much concerned about traffic issues, but I think that's true of any development and, especially one of this scale. So, I'm really impressed actually by the amount of thought and care that went into your design, and I actually like this revised plan. So, there's a lot of things that I think is out of our control, but I think you took a lot of care into addressing all the things that we talked about before in terms of water conservation, renewable energy, and all that stuff. So I don't really have any questions. I just think you did a great job. So
Thank you.
So back still on parking, I have a question I'll insert here. Did I hear correctly that there's a plan in order to enact the TDM plan, that you would have permit parking for the tenants of these 3 buildings?
Don't believe that there was that mentioned. I think the one new thing from last time is we have looked at doing valet.
Right.
I think you mentioned some of the most recent projects that we're seeing, and this is actually, we'd much rather find sustainable ways than build big parking garages. So we're okay with having less, and one of the strategies that especially technology is helping with is making valet much more functional and feasible in office campuses. And so as Daniel mentioned, we believe there's a 10 to 20% increase in the number of site parking spaces if we did implement a valet. And whether it's a single tenant or multi-tenant, because we treat this as a campus, it's something we'll work with those tenants to provide that as a service if parking was challenged. That could also increase our numbers beyond the TDM strategy that he outlined. But no, there was no mention of permit parking.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Gooding?
Yes, still on the parking issue. You cited, I think, Gilead and Genentech, which is, a couple of experience bases. But for how long a period of time is that data? I mean, for how long have these folks been in place so that you have parking, which equals traffic? I mean, it's the same thing. That gives you some reliable assumptions as to what your load's really going to be.
I'm sorry, can you clarify for how long have they achieved those levels of parking demand?
Right. Yeah. I mean, is it for a couple years it stayed low, or is it 10 years, or is it 15 years?
It's been over a pretty sustained period of time. Typically what we've seen is many of these life sciences projects that have been approved over the last 10 to 15 years have increasingly had more stringent TDM programs, and also increasingly I think the evolution of these project types and the ways that they are used and the intensities at which they're used have evolved as well. So Genentech, for the most part, has been achieving a 50 to 60% drive alone rate for much of the last decade, and Gilead as well has kind of had a fairly sustained low parking demand over time. So generally, there was an interesting TDM monitoring report that was recently released in South San Francisco, just across the way, and it found that most life sciences tenants there are now getting about a 25 to 30% TDM reduction through implementation of their ordinance So there's some comparable cases out there.
And so I know I read in there that you have to keep reporting on the results or the actual experience of this TDM plan for several years, throughout the early life of the project. What if you're wrong? What if you just are not making those goals and there's just overflow cars? Where do they go? What do you do?
I think it's a day-to-day monitoring exercise, and it is. It starts with having a very good marketing program and really embedding that in the tenant, and I'm sure that folks can speak to that a little bit more. But often how these programs work is you have your on-site TDM coordinator, and day one when a tenant moves in, they get a welcome packet and they learn about the Sierra Point shuttle and they learn about the transit subsidy programs and everything. And from that day forward, then there is a ongoing balance of really the supply and demand of the parking garage, and getting a good sense of the rhythm of kind of a typical day, and whether or not there needs to be a lunchtime valet because you have folks coming from nearby life sciences campuses who want to dine at the site, or if there's other unique seasonal factors or things like that. So the answer is really one of this is a blueprint for how you may achieve the level of parking reduction, but it's also that blueprint needs to be continually updated and monitored, and perhaps the incentives change over time, and even we're seeing some of the more aggressive cases such as a Facebook or Stanford or Genentech that now actually pay their employees not to drive, and sometimes it's as little as a couple dollars a day, but depending on what it really takes to achieve that supply and demand, there's a range of strategies on the table.
Thank you.
Commissioner Patel?
So, I'm familiar with the Genentech campus, but I'm not familiar with the Gilead campus. This site is unique in that there is a public component to this site, in that the Brisbane Marina is there. There's areas that are supposed to be accessed by the public. One of the recommendations was that parts of the campus be amenable to public use. If there's a 200 space shortage parking, that's going to then be that overflow goes into other areas, other parking areas of this particular piece of land. How would this be addressed in terms of keeping the public out by just not providing spaces for parking?
So because it's a life science campus, it's fully staffed 365 days a year, 24/7. Some of the thinking and where we've placed the public spaces in that surface lot is really that's where we'll focus it. And we own, I don't know if any of you have been to Fucasia at Centennial Towers, is what it used to be known as. We call it Genesis, South San Francisco. We have a similar situation where we have a surface lot but a garage in the back. The garage is for the tenants and the surface lot is for the public, and that is policed, and we do make sure that there's spots available so at lunchtime when people come and want to use similar common amenities that the public can use at that campus. And so it's something that, because this is being operated in by a staff at all times, property management will ensure there's spaces available for the public for lunch times and other meetings and stuff like that.
Thank you. I think I can echo the same concern in that there are public lots down by the marina, and I think the propensity for someone who says, I just want to drive, to park down there and walk back, it seems far, but I could see people doing it. So there's a concern with not taking those public spaces, because there is, as you know, there's a lot of development going on at Sierra Point, and there will be a tighter parking situation for anyone who's been using someone else's lots. That's why I asked about, I think you mentioned permit somehow when you made your presentation. And it seems if perhaps whoever was in charge of the TDM program actually issued permits to those who are going to park on site, it would help regulate, because you'd know who was actually there, and it wouldn't be just who showed up and drove in that day. So I think what we're looking for, just to kind of wrap it up, is some assurances that this is really going to be monitored, and how often those statistics are going to be passed on to the city to verify that this is really a very aggressive and stringent policy that is not to be taken lightly, because it is a big parking variance. So we want the success of your building, but we also don't want you to impact your neighbors, because that impacts their success. I think you can understand. And as far as the traffic, I just make a note on that, what staff mentioned. There's so many things changing within Oyster Point. Why are Sierra Point and Oyster Point not connected? Caltrans is looking at Highway 101. Should it ever be widened, modified, the interchanges? There's so much up in the air. So it's very difficult to plan ahead on this and say this is the solution to the traffic woes. We don't know. It's going to happen piecemeal as things happen. So parking is one thing you'll have control over. So I appreciate what you can do in that regard, and any reassurances you can give us that will be a very stringent follow through.
I'm Neil Fox. I'm the CEO of Phase 3 Properties, and one of the things I wanted to share with you is, can we go back to the slide where it showed Gilead? You know, we throw names like Gilead and Genentech around, and to put that in perspective, these are companies that are massive that sell drugs. Most of the companies that we're doing business with, and what our product is focused on, is what I'd call basic research discovery type companies. Those companies don't have products. So they're much more heavily in the lab portion of the spectrum, meaning that their spaces require more lab space, which is far less dense than office space. So when I see these numbers that we're at 1.875 per rentable square foot versus the 2.28 or 2.255, knowing that Gilead and them are actually massive companies with massive sales forces, massive regulatory, groups within these companies, so many more office people than what our typical life science company has, it gives me great, I don't have huge concern. But Commissioner Gooding, you asked, how do we know? Well, who parking is the biggest issue for is the tenants. And the way we learn is, if we can't lease this building, where do I have to fix it? And that's one of the reasons why we bought the building next door, because it gives us an opportunity and some flexibility if we had to come in and fix this parking. We don't think we'll ever have to go there, because we're actually seeing in all our properties a trend toward less use. The other thing that's really great about life sciences for this project, and don't get me wrong, I would love to see Gilead come and lease this whole campus. That would be wonderful. One of the nice things about it is, if you get a user like that, they have the resources to fix the parking themselves and provide the transportation for their employees like they do in their current locations. But one of the nice things about life sciences compared to office, and you can go and sit in front of our Genesis project in South City at 5 o'clock, and you can watch who comes out of that building. We have the whole top floors of this project is SAP. It's an office tenant. And 5 o'clock hits, and there's just streams of people going out the building, jumping on their buses. You don't see the life science employees come out. They work very different hours than office tenants do. And it's one of the things that's going to really help, that flow of traffic to the area. Because they come early, they come late, they stay, they work really unusual hours. These are scientists that, spend, sometimes all night in their labs doing, their experiments. So I think it will really help with the traffic flow because of who the tenants are that we're anticipating to go into these buildings. But, that's one of the things. We're committed to making certain that this building's leasable. It would be a travesty if we built this and didn't get it leased. So.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, can we move beyond parking? Any other questions? Commissioner Gooding?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Patel?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Gomez?
No thanks.
Commissioner Ison?
Nope.
I have one. On the landscape plan, and under the report from LSA Attachment B Environmental Checklist, which is on, it's listed as page B16. And this had come up, a member or two of the public had previously expressed concern about the slough and wildlife and mitigation measures there. And under this report from LSA, it mentions mitigation measure bio-1B. The applicant shall construct a permanent fence adjacent to the pedestrian path and bay trail along the western and northern edge of the project site to restrict access of humans and dogs into the salt marsh. Further in the same paragraph, it says the upland habitat on the project site should be landscaped with native shrub species, such as lists a bunch of different plants. On the landscape plan, I did not see this. I didn't see a fence, and I did not see shrubs. I saw trees at the northwest corner and the grass pavers, but it looks like the area adjacent to the slough does not have either a fence or the low native shrubs. Could you help me out with that?
It's a good point. We are actually, our plan is very much as we discussed last time, which was to plant that area along the edge with thick, low shrubs and try and avoid having a tall fence. That we still have a little ways to go on this. But if we did have a fence, we would put it down low, basically to keep dogs out. But I think we can do it. Our intent is to do it without the fence and just do it with the section, which is actually fairly steep for much of it, and plant it thickly.
Because you have on one of your landscape lists, trying to think of what it was. Well, you could go through your list of species, but there are several on there that are fairly dense native species that could probably do the job and will grow tall enough to suffice. And then in a segue to that, the stormwater management plan. I read and I saw nothing about reclaiming water, and I read a lot about future water needs, but I saw nothing about capturing stormwater. Has that been addressed at all? And perhaps repurposed to landscaping? Not that we've had a lot of rain over the past couple years, but
Last day or so. Yeah, hi, this is Tom Morse with BKF Engineers, so a civil engineer for Phase 3. We did talk about it initially when we started working on the project, but what we find is that it's not really very effective with the seasonal rainfall that we get here, and that there are other ways to work with water and take the water that we do have, make sure we treat it and get it back into the bay and into the slough. But it's not very effective trying to reuse it in the building because it's so seasonal that it doesn't help very much, and you spend a lot of money in the building, dual plumbing the building.
okay.
May I?
Yes.
So I guess that kind of triggered initial thoughts or additional thoughts, I guess, around the fact that so there's going to be a lot of landscape, a lot of natural environment, a lot of habitat here. If we have continuous drought years, the water footprint, if you will, quote unquote, could be quite significant. And so that's why I think that is a valid point to say, well, what could be from an
Gray water.
Yeah. Is that feasible? Does it throw a wrench in the economics of the overall? I mean, because this is a really ambitious proposal, and I think it does merit some additional thought.
Well, no matter what, you've got trees, you've got some things that even drought resistant, they're going to need water. That green lawn is going to need constant watering. So, and I looked at the future plan on water and Brisbane's resources, and I went, whoa, you're going to have some landscaping. It's beautiful. I mean, it's very nicely done, but then I said, have they thought about any way to capture rainwater or reuse gray water? That's something I would really like to see on this. Just because to say other buildings may have not considered that to date, you're on the cutting edge and you're making what looks like a landmark building. You've put an extreme amount of thought into it. And that's one element that just would shine, that you've addressed that component.
Take under consideration. I think it's a good, noble intent.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Are there any other members of the public that would like to address the commission on this project? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
I make a motion to close the public hearing.
And a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No. Okay. Commissioners, discussion. Commissioner Patel, let's have you start.
So, to approve the parking use permit, what we have to find and consider is to consider and give due regard to the nature and condition of adjacent uses and structures and to general and specific plans for the area in question. And then to determine whether or not the establishment, maintenance, or operation of the use applied for will, under the circumstances of the particular case, be detrimental to the health, safety, comfort, or general welfare of the persons residing or working in the neighborhood of such proposed use, or whether it would be injurious or detrimental to property improvements in the neighborhood or the general welfare of the city. My question, I guess, would be is if we approve this particular use permit and then there is parking issues for the general public in that area, what recourse is there if we've approved this use permit? And what sort of systems are in place to address concerns that the public may have of not having access by car to this area because of not enough parking? And I understand all of the numbers. I understand it's a biotech area, and I just want to know if there's a contingency plan.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to understand, when we talk about typically the context of where we see issues about public-private parking conflict come in areas that are close to central Brisbane, where maybe it's people parking in residential neighborhoods or overflow from commercial areas, and you have basically a very direct conflict between residential parking and business parking. I'm not quite sure in the context of Sierra Point, where you have public parking well removed. You have no public parking here, you have no residential uses. I'm trying to sort of drill down as to what your kind of concern is.
So my concern is that this is supposed to be a public-private endeavor, right? There's supposed to be areas where the public are supposed to have access to this particular building, to have access to this to the Bay Trail, to have access to the areas around the marina. They're supposed to have access to the gym. They're supposed to have access to the restaurant. If there's a 200 parking shortfall, and there does end up being a 200 parking shortfall, so the public doesn't have access, how are we going to address that?
Well, again, I think there's a couple things. One is, you have evidence before you. The idea there's a 200 space shortfall is based on a code requirement that we don't even think is reasonable. So you're taking kind of a sort of an extreme. There's the code and reality are very different here in terms of what the actual requirements are. But I mean, hypothetically, also Sierra Point, the way it works with the marina and the public space, there is several hundreds of spaces of public parking at the east end, right, in the northeast corner of Sierra Point that are available for public use. We would expect that anybody who were to park and wanted to enjoy any of the public amenities on Sierra Point, whether it be the yacht club or walking along the Bay Trail or patronizing a business open to the public, if they weren't able to park on a private property, and they'd have the ability to park in existing public parking to patronize uses open to the public.
Okay, so then I have two questions. Are you saying that the 200 parking shortfall that was in the papers, it's actually not going to, that's just a number that's sort of,
Where's that?
I think what John was talking about, so the shortfall between what our code requires for office and what they're providing is much more than 200 spaces, right?
Right.
It's like 700 spaces.
Right.
And then the delta that the Fair and Piers report had was about
200 spaces based on
which
life
is-
life
right.
science.
Right. Well, based on the life sciences examples that, from the data they've collected, which the applicant then was saying even for those types of companies like Gilead and Genentech, they believe they will have a much lesser footprint. But yes, that 200 space, that's what you're thinking is from Fair and Piers.
That's what I thought. And so my question is assuming that there is a 200 spot shortfall, and those spots are being occupied where where people from the public would be using, what is the mechanism in place so that there's some way to address that issue?
Again, there's an annual requirement that they report the results of their TDM program, which again would either validate that there's a shortfall and they're achieving the reduction in trips and single occupant use of the parking, or it doesn't. If they were to demonstrate that they were not achieving the required goals, then we would be looking at them to ratchet up the aggressiveness of their TDM program. If you had a situation then where sort of building occupants were utilizing public parking as kind of privatizing public parking, the city can certainly cite, in their citation capacity, the city can monitor public parking to make sure it's used for public use. I think that's really the bigger concern we would have, is someone privatizing public parking, not so much the public using public parking and patronizing publicly open uses on Sierra Point. But there are definitely vehicles to monitor and enforce the free use of public parking by the public.
So that is my concern, is
Yeah.
the privatization portion of it.
Yeah.
So there are mechanisms in place where the public could make a complaint, or how does, or
Well, the
and
city
then-
does patrol. I mean, if the city felt that were a concern, they can put hourly limits on public parking. They have all sorts of, the city controls our public parking however we see fit, and can manage it in a dynamic fashion to promote or preclude certain behaviors that we're either trying to promote or preclude.
so, I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask a follow-up question, just because I'm ignorant on this. And how would that happen? So let's say that there was a 200, let's say there is a privatization of public parking, and we wanted to make it 2-hour parking or 3-hour parking. How would that happen?
The city council could I don't think it'd be by resolution, could establish those kind of parking limits at those parking spots and spaces at Sierra Point, if that was their desire.
And is it okay if I can just add? I think the whole nature of the TDM program, it's not set in stone. And as their consultant kind of testified to you guys, it's something that can change. And if they need to get more aggressive, that can totally happen. They're not committing to just the same 6 strategies forever and ever. They can ramp up and get more aggressive if it's found that they're actually having overflow parking or not enough parking supply. So it is a very dynamic program.
Commissioner Gooding,
Nothing further, thank you.
may I ask the TDM report, how often, have we stipulated how often that is to be provided?
Annual, at least, to the city, and that's in the resolution. I think it's condition R. But it would be an annual report. That's what we required for Sangamo as well.
Okay.
But that's not to say that we, if there are real complaints and there are real impacts, we will know, and there's something that we can address.
And
But
it could be required to be more frequent if there's a problem.
sure.
Okay. And Commissioner Patel, I would circle back because I was trying to recall, I believe there are 2 public lots with 8 spaces each attached to this, which would address some visitor parking to the gym and or the restaurant, and the Bay Trail being accessible by other areas. I think that if those public spaces were filled, people would start the Bay Trail just at another location, perhaps. I'm just guessing on it. Commissioner Seisman?
No, and I think they also said they were putting in 24 public bike racks or spaces. So there's access that way too, so, maybe, people won't be driving, they wanna frequent the cafes or the gym, maybe they can bike there, so maybe that's not that much of an issue.
Okay. Any other comments you want to make?
No.
No? Okay. Commissioner Gomez, you look,
I was just thinking about the whole area, looking at this. Again, thank you for the presentation. It's extremely compelling. You made valid points around you want to have a property that's going to have an anchor tenant, and you want to have the vision and the all the intangible components that are going to make it work for the site, with all the given considerations that it's right on the water, and we've got a lot of there's a lot of challenges with that location from a lot of different perspectives, but I think all the requirements have been analyzed, and it's very logical. But I do think I am hung up on this water footprint issue, and I don't know where to go with that. But I do think that requires a little bit more creative thinking. And I just don't know what we do with that, because I'm very impressed, but I do think about a multi-year drought scenario. I am an environmental scientist, and so I think about these things, right? Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there, and I don't really know what we can do at this point, because based upon my reading of the document, it's not really stipulated in there. So.
Through the chair, is it okay if staff addresses?
Oh, yeah, please do. I'm
Sure. So,
pontificating.
so obviously we have our own water conservation and landscaping ordinance in Title 15 that applies to any project, would apply to this project, applies a water budget that, they basically design their irrigation plan to not exceed. So that's just basic blanket controlling how much water is being used for landscape irrigation at any time. When it comes to actual drought years, in a either single or multi-year drought scenario, the city would be subject to reductions in supply across the board.
Right.
And typically the way that so the most recent drought, I don't know if you guys recall, you were not allowed to irrigate your yard.
Right.
Or every other day or whatever, even days, whatever. That type of kind of smaller restriction would be much more wide scale if it was an extended drought. So basically in that kind of worst case scenario, doesn't really matter if they have a landscape that demands a lot of water, because they wouldn't be watering their landscape just like everyone else. So I think from that standpoint, we have a lot of just kind of austerity measures that would apply to everyone, not just this particular property, to make sure that our water is not being used to water plants instead of people.
So I guess, no, I hear you loud and clear. I guess and this is back to the earlier point on a gray water system or some sort of catchment system, and it just seems that's not economical for projects of this size. If that's what I haven't heard that explicitly, but I guess that's what I'm kind of reading through. That's why it's not in the design element.
I think you
Right.
did hear that.
Yeah.
It would be expensive to have two.
It would
sets
be
of plumbing.
extremely expensive to have two sets of plumbing, right? I get that. The public benefit on this is huge for having all the habitat space, right? I mean, that's going to be a big attractive point. That's going to make it, I think, really dynamic. I know it's very common with the new developments to do bioswales. I'm pretty sure that's because that's the rules and regulations. So whether you go to the Cove or you go to Stanford or you go to these new places, Gilead has a bunch of those bioswales, and that's pretty nice, and that's for stormwater management. I'm just thinking, and I'm not the type of person to think worst case scenario, but I'm thinking, scenario where we've got these multi-year droughts, and are we going to have a situation with a lot of dead trees?
how about we circle back with this? The applicants presented us with a very innovative design. It's extremely well thought, and to me it was stunning to go back to the original project, which just looked like a massive parking lot with 3 very tall buildings. That was it, with a nice big parking structure facing the highway, which we see to our south, a lot of places. And instead, we have an extremely distinctive looking building as a proposed replacement for that. So I'm very impressed with your time and your diligence and coming back to us and trying to think of all the details. So based on the innovation that you've done with this design, while not required, I think that as innovative as you've been, maybe you can think of a way, even if you capture a minute amount of gray water from this site, it could address part of your landscaping needs. So as staff says, we go in a drought cycle and we demand reduced consumption of water, and you see some of your shrubs and your plants and your trees suffering, maybe you can address that and find a way that in one phase, without going into dual plumbing, that you say, yeah, there's a little bit of gray water we could maybe divert for irrigation, or find a way to capture, even if we have drought years, the years when you have the rain, capture the water and use it, defray your water bill. Score big points with the community and with Sierra Point, with everyone else, that you've really taken this head on, and that you rose to the occasion with the planning commissioner challenging you to do it. So while we can't require it, I would like to see you maybe think about it. And if nothing else, you know it's going to come up in the future. There's going to be drought years. You're going to be facing this. Why put it off? You're at the point now, you're just on paper. Why not think about it now? Just think about it now. John, looks like you're trying to say something.
Well, just getting through the chair, we didn't belabor the point, but there was a fair amount of conversation with the Public Works Department, the city's water department, about ways to offset water demand with this project that involved off-site sort of contribution to city programs that might reduce off-site water demand. So again, I think it's very laudable in the idea of doing on-site what you can. But if you look at the big picture, maybe there are some questions about what's the most bang for anybody's buck and a citywide benefit. And I think through the Public Works Department and the Water Department, they really are focusing on citywide initiatives to offset demand and have this particular development contribute financially to those kind of programs and other sort of aquifer recharge studies and whatnot. So I wouldn't, there's certainly a lot of thought given to how you offset demand. It just may be that the most efficient way isn't to do it on a case-by-case, project-by-project specific means, and that's kind of what the Water Department is looking at this as a sort of holistic issue and how this particular project might contribute to a larger holistic solution.
Could I just tag on
Sure.
to that? So
Please do.
the only revised, or one of the only revised mitigation measures was the mitigation measure regarding water supply. So essentially what the Water Department came up with is, in an effort to enhance our overall elasticity of supply in single and multi-year drought years, we're looking to kind of get away from just our single supplier of, hetchy water. And so the applicant has agreed to contribute funds to a study for aquifer banking and injection, which would, depending on the outcome of the study, could really help us increase our supply during those drought years and not have to institute such austere measures in reduction for everyone. So, again, not to take away from making the site as, sustainable as possible. Gray water is a really great option, but the applicant is also contributing to kind of this citywide supply enhancement effort as well. So,
Thank you, staff. You kind of rounded the whole picture, brought it full circle, gave us maybe a better perspective. Anyone else have final comments?
So it sounds like they've addressed the water issue by
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've advanced and helped me understand kind of the bigger picture. And I didn't mean to belabor the point, but
Right.
it's something that is on my mind at a big level across the state.
Okay, I think you've brought us an exceptional project that could be a landmark out there. So I'd like to see us go to a vote if someone would like to entertain a motion on this.
Just for clarity, are we
Yes.
doing Because are we doing it all at one motion for all?
Yeah, so it would be a motion to adopt the resolution as drafted with the or as amended by the errata sheet on your table. So you can just say moving adoption of the resolution as amended by staff, or however you want to package it.
Want to make that motion?
I make a motion, I make a motion to approve, is it DP-5-07, UP-3-08, and V-108?
How about DP1-18, V1-18,
Oh, okay.
UP1-.
Okay, I'll reiterate that. So I make a motion that we approve applications DP-1-18, UP-1-18, V-1-18
With amendments.
with amendments.
And
And-
a second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No. Motion carries. Congratulations. Look forward to seeing your project. Thank you. All right, we move on to items initiated by staff.
We'll meet next on December 13th, but we will be canceling the 27th meeting, so. Unless you really want to.
No, it's okay.
And I don't have any other items that I can think of. Julie.
The introduction of the cannabis
Oh,
ordinance?
yeah, the cannabis ordinance and the mobile home park rezoning, those were both approved by the council and just waiting for their official adoption, so both. of
Which will
those
be on
are
December 6th.
Endorsed. And you may be seeing back early next year, I don't know if anybody was on the commission, and Chair Mackin may have been, maybe not, short-term rentals.
Yes,
Okay.
I wasn't there, but I attended those.
Okay. They may be trickling back down to the planning commission with some further
Interesting
direction
topic.
from the city council early next calendar year. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it filled the room, I remember. Okay.
May I
that
ask
should
one,
be-
one quick question?
Yeah.
John, can you just re-explain the cannabis thing? I just missed it.
Oh, the one you just recently approved was to extend the hours of operation.
Right.
Or eliminate prohibitions on hours of operation. And that was, again, something council directed us to initiate and was endorsed, and they followed through on that.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. Any items initiated by the commission? Nope. That being said, I'll take a motion for adjournment to our next meeting of Thursday, December 13, 2018 at 7:30.
Second.
Second. All in favor? Aye. No one opposed. Thank you.